things off in that way with a kind of overview of where we sit with fatigue. So thank you very much, Linda and Patrick. We now have, we're drilling down a little bit now, and I have great pleasure in introducing Jim Potvin from McMaster University. And many of you know Jim, but I always like to hear him talk. And here he's currently a master, extensive experience in the auto industry. So we look forward to him and the methods that he's been developing. So Jim, whenever you're ready. There you are.
Good morning. I think this follows up pretty well with the talk that was just given. I want to talk a little bit about where we are right now with regards to research and coming up with methods to predict rest allowances and also sort of predict fatigue levels during more complex tasks. Just so I kind of know where I am and how I'm going to handle this, can I just get a show of hands of people that saw the webinar that was on recently? Okay, I'm going to try to keep this as fresh as I can for you guys, but there's some things I want to share as well with the rest of the people. So what I'm going to talk about today is trying to figure out acceptable demands. And this is a big issue for ergonomists and trying to help engineers determine what's acceptable. Of course, we don't want to make loads as low as possible all the time because we know we need production and we know we need to keep these companies profitable because that's where the jobs are. So there's sort of a delicate balance there. The issue though is while we have lots of data for single effort maximum strength, we don't have as much data for repetitive or prolonged tasks. And so I sort of color coded these here. I think we have lots of data for prolonged isometric efforts and understanding endurance times and how far along we are with those endurance times. I'll talk today sort of probably mostly about intermittent tasks and where we are with those and a sort of a method I've developed recently to try to tackle that. But we really almost know nothing about how tasks get combined, the effects of pushing on this thing and using this hand tool and then pulling on this object or lifting and lowering and then pushing. We can analyze individual tasks, but we can't analyze tasks combined. So how do we handle that? So let's sort of start with what we know a fair bit about, and that is sort of endurance times with different relative efforts. So for example, you can see here this blue curve would be the curve from Romert, and on the x-axis would indicate the relative effort as a percentage of maximum, and the y-axis would indicate the maximum holding time that we would predict. Here's some very good data here for different, we can actually see that this differs for different joints. Is Laura still here? Laura Freylaw? So Laura joined us yesterday from Iowa, and she's done some really great work looking at trying to solidify what we know about endurance times at for different joints. And it is important to realize that this is going to be joint specific. It's obviously going to depend on how much fast twitch and slow twitch muscles are crossing the joint, which are the agonists and antagonists. We have a pretty good sense of this. There's lots of data out there like this. The problem is most jobs aren't like this. Most people don't sustain some level for extended periods of time. If they do, it's probably because of a bad design. And usually what happens is people do things intermittently. So what do we know about that? So most of you are familiar with the Romert rest allowance equation, or many of you may be. Basically what this tries to do is we know that the risk of fatigue, the risk of injury, is always going to depend on what is the demand on the muscles or the tissues, and what is the capacity of those tissues to bear that demand. I mean, that pretty much goes for anything breaking. And those demands can be single demands. You can break your leg skiing in a single time accident, or they can be repetitive demands where there's not, we talked a lot yesterday about sort of breakdown and recovery and that cycle, which is very healthy and natural, but if the breakdown exceeds the recovery, then we're going to have problems. So if you look at the top here, this equation sort of is broken into two things. One is, what is the strength demand? You can measure that with a force gauge, or maybe use software like 3D SSPP to figure out a moment at the knee or the shoulder. And what are the strengths? And so, for example, if you use a software like the 3D SSPP or Jack, inherent in that software is that it will determine the posture of the mannequin. It will say, well, for that knee angle, given force-length relationships and data that's been collected in the literature, we might estimate that the female strength would be here, or the male strength would be here. And then you can say, okay, well, what is the moment and what is that divided by the strength? And you might say, well, maybe I want to calculate the strength based on a weak female, 25th percentile female, so now I'm designing for 75% of the population. And then it also says, okay, well, how long is that effort being held? And then what is that as a percentage of the endurance time, which is what I just showed you. So we have a strength demand divided by a capacity, and we have an endurance demand divided by that capacity. So just to give you a sense of how that works, it would probably make sense to you intuitively. I mean, even as a child, you would know if you did something with a lower effort, you're not going to need that. You know, if you ran for 10 meters, you're not going to need as much of a break as if you ran at high speed for 40 meters. And so here we can see, if you look at the y-axis, you can sort of think of this as the need for rest, or you can think of it as the amount of fatigue that's accumulated. So at a 20% effort, let's say you go 1.5 minutes, you would accumulate a certain amount of fatigue, and you would need 3/4 of a minute to recover, about 45 seconds. If you were at a higher intensity, then that fatigue would accumulate more rapidly, and let's say you got to the same relative decrease in force capacity or fatigue level, however you want to think of it, you would need more or less an equal amount of recovery, and then at a very high intensity, that would happen in about 1/3 of the time is 20%. So you can see that we've only doubled the percentage from 20 to 40, and yet we've quadrupled the need, or we've cut it by 1/4 the amount of time it takes to accumulate the same amount of fatigue. Now, what are the limitations of that method? Well, there are a few, and I'll sort of touch on some of them a little bit later as well, but one is that it assumes on-off. So you're on for a certain amount of time, and then you're off for a certain amount of time, and when you're on, you're always on at the same level. So most of you realize that there are very few tasks out there that fall into this characteristic. The other is you'll see this sort of red line, vertical line here. What it says is at efforts less than 15%, the assumption is that you can do things indefinitely. And I do an experiment in my ergonomics class where I have people hold their arm out here for about 5 minutes, and we kind of look at ratings of perceived discomfort. Well, most people are pretty exhausted by that time, and if you look at that in a 3D static, that's about 12% of maximum for males and 15% for females. It's obvious that we can't hold 15% contractions all day. So what do we do about this? So one of the answers, I think, comes in psychophysics. And so if we're going to come back here to intermittent tasks and trying to understand them, a lot of us are familiar with the Snook tables, or he prefers them to be called the Liberty Mutual tables. A lot of work done at Liberty Mutual with Snook and Sorello, as well as some very good work, which doesn't get as much recognition by IU, but any of you that use the Untitled tables use that data as well. But a lot of the work that we look at is related to upper extremities. I started studying the back. That you saw that flow chart that Richard put up. I mean, that was for my PhD thesis. And I realized, started to work with the automotive companies, that a lot of the questions were more upper extremity and a lot more repetitive than we were used to. So what is psychophysics and how can it be used? First of all, Stephen sort of discovered that there was a very good relationship, that this relationship changes dependent on the sensation, between the sensations we feel, the light, the amount of brightness that we're all perceiving in this room might be slightly different for all of us, and then what that actual physical phenomenon is. So psychophysics is our psychological perception of a physical phenomenon. And you can see here that whether it's brightness or it's electrical shock, that as that stimulus intensity goes up, the actual physical stimulus, there's a fairly characteristic relationship between that. And if we can characterize the nonlinearity of that, then we can maybe use psychophysics to help us understand what people can do. We can't ask them to lift until they get hurt and go, oh, I guess that's the load that's unacceptable. So we've realized that people are pretty good transducers and can understand what their own capabilities are. And so Snook and Irvine in 1967 were the first to really use psychophysics in an ergonomic sense. And they used this originally for manual materials handling. And then in 95, Snook began to actually do psychophysical studies of the upper extremities. So we're all familiar with the sort of lift, lowering, push, pull, carry tables, but then this started to be applied to the upper extremities. So just kind of quickly to give you a sense of what a psychophysical study, a good one, looks like, this was sort of the methodology that was set up in the Liberty Mutual labs. Subjects typically control something. In most of their studies, they control the amount of force that they find acceptable, or if it's wrist flexion extension, it would be the amount of torque that they would find acceptable. So the procedure then would be the subject is given a repetition rate that they have to do this. Presumably as that repetition rate would go up, you'd expect that what they found acceptable would go down. You give them different task requirements. I'll just show you an example of one of the studies, either gripping or pronating like with a screwdriver, wrist flexion, extension. The subject then can control the amount of resistance, and so every 15 minutes that is changed, and they sort of come, and it's on an unmarked dial, and you want to make sure they consistently come back to what they find acceptable. I'll show you an example of what an actual study looks like. And I'll just read you the instructions because they're important. So the people are told to work as if they were on an incentive basis, getting paid for the amount of work they perform. They're asked to work as hard as they could without developing unusual discomfort in the hands, wrists, and forearms. And I'll talk a little bit about what makes up a good psychophysical study. I may not have a ton of time to get into it, but one thing is you need to let people experience this, go home, come back the next day, come back a couple days later, because people might think something's okay for them and go home and be very sore, or think something maybe was too hard for them, go home, realize they're okay. They need to sort of calibrate that. And these studies are done over weeks. And we've done some of these studies. They take a long time. So here's an example of a couple of the different tasks that they had people do, sort of a pronation, a supination task with a particular grip, doing a supination with more of a yoke grip, repetitive hand gripping tasks, and then repetitive ulnar deviation tasks. And people are sort of strapped in to control things. Other things like heart rate and ratings of perceived discomfort are collected just to make sure that subjects are not exceeding what they can do. One of the other studies that I've sort of included in my method was a good study by Ann Moore and Richard Wells, where they had people had to break basically a hand tool, and they could set the resistance. So they had to generate an extensor moment of the wrist to break this. And this is, I'll show you, one of the only studies that have looked at fairly high duty cycles, which is an issue. We don't have a ton of data in that area. So this is a study that we did for Ford Motor Company. They have a lot of automotive, there's tons of electrical connections that need to be made, and they have no specific data. They had things like a strain index to analyze this with. So we wanted to go in and find out what was acceptable for these kinds of tasks. So we had 24 females in that study, and they were trained over about 27 hours, which was on the low end of the training that you need to do. They did this at 2, 7, and 13. That was sort of the range of connector frequencies we saw. We had a couple different grips and interfaces that they did this with, and they did it in a couple different postures. And in every case, subjects were asked to tell us what they felt was acceptable for that task. And then we also had them do maximal efforts, which actually ended up being really important. And luckily, people like Snook had done these maximum efforts as well. So first of all, we knew what their maximum strength was, and then we knew what was acceptable for repetitive tasks. So all of these studies need some sort of device that you simulate the task. This one here, most of this would not be seen by the subject. They'd see this unmarked dial, and they'd have something to interface, either to push on with their finger or to grip with a pinch grip and push. And basically we set up, we have a force gauge here, and whatever you spin this dial, it kind of moves this part forward and backward, kind of increases the force in the spring, it makes it harder or easier to do. So typically with human data, you're going to have variability. So each effort in, let's say, the final 15 minutes of a condition, this happened to be for 7 per minute for finger presses and a neutral wrist, we would look at things like the amount of impulse, but usually we look at the peak force. And you can see here, for example, these are all in pounds because it was all done for Ford over in the States, but 8.5 pounds plus or minus 7, that would be our best guess, that 8.5, what was acceptable to that subject for that condition, at that frequency for that grip. And then I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but there's kind of a way we've used to try to estimate the duration of that effort. So I just kind of, for the sake of time, I'll move on. So here would be what those peaks look like over the course of a session, and we're really interested in what that average was at the end. And you'll see, for example, here after this 15 minutes, we would have really reduced the load, unbeknownst to the subject. They know it's going to change, but they sort of turn their back to it. So of course the forces are quite low, and then they kind of overshoot, and they eventually settle in kind of to the forces that they had at the end. We've also done some work with my colleague when I was at Windsor with Dave Andrews, looking at hose insertions. And again, for the sake of time, I'll just sort of, hose insertions are very prevalent in automotive. They tend to be done at lower frequencies. The problem with hoses is they need to be very easy to go on and very hard to come off. And so it's a real challenge. So the forces tend to be quite high. And so we looked at a couple different postures and some frequencies and measured some similar things. So what I did was I said, well, I wonder if there's some common relationships across all of this research. And I wanted to see if there was some things that I could pull together. And so I've recently published a paper attempting to integrate the studies that I would have found to be the ones that met a number of criteria. That there was a lot of training, and that they basically spelled things out in a way that, in terms of the data I needed. And before I go on, I just kind of want to define what I mean by duty cycle. People use it in different ways, but basically it's the amount of work time divided by the total cycle time. So for example, here we might have someone doing a task where they are 3 seconds, 6 seconds on and 6 seconds off, and they would repeat that cycle 5 times a minute. So 5 times a minute times the 6 seconds each effort, there would be a total of 30 seconds of work divided by the 60 seconds of the cycle. So that would be a duty cycle of 50%. But you can also get a duty cycle of 50% by having a situation like this. So it's a bit of a limitation in that not all duty cycles are created the exact same, but you'll see that there's some very common relationships that come out of this. So not to bore you with a big busy table, but this is just to say I did a lot of work to try to pull all of this stuff together on your behalf. Some of you probably don't think it's your behalf, but, or you won't. But so the point I'm trying to make with this is that there were many different types of tasks here, all with different frequencies, durations, duty cycles, and then in each case we knew sort of what the maximum acceptable efforts were in terms of force or torque. But we could also divide that by the absolute maximum strength to figure out what percentage that was. And my first guess was that I should be able to guess from frequency what the acceptable forces would be. But as you'll see from this slide, it's quite a bit of a mess. And so there was no real, I mean, you could see some relationships there, but it doesn't follow this sort of hyperbolic curve that you would typically expect with biological data. And all frequencies were not created equal. But there's a lot of data in there, so I thought there's got to be something here, and began to sort of think about it. Richard started talking more and more about duty cycles, and so I thought, well, I wonder if instead of just taking the frequency from these studies, if I instead plotted against duty cycle. And when I did that, I ended up with a curve that looked a lot more like I would have expected. And now we have many different studies with different tasks at different durations and different frequencies. And you see a fairly nice relationship between duty cycle, and when I say maximum acceptable effort, I mean, when it says 0.4 or 40%, it means that you could do 40% of your maximum strength in that position. Now you may choose to design for a 75th percent capable, or what we call 25th percentile person. And so if I just take all of those dots and make them yellow to kind of show you the relationship, I came up with a fairly simple equation, which would say that if you knew the duty cycle on this x-axis, and what goes in the equation would be 0.4, for example, for 40%. This here is just, you can do a maximum effort for 1 second a day. So if you divide 1 second into 8 hours, that's what this ratio comes out to be. That's how many seconds there are in an 8-hour work shift. But except for the very, very low, I mean, it's essentially 1 minus duty cycle to the exponent of 0.24. Now, one thing that I didn't show in any of the talks I've done before is this equation can be rearranged so that if you know what the effort is, you've measured the force, you've done a 3D static, or you've looked up data, you can actually calculate the acceptable duty cycle. And of course, if the acceptable duty cycle is 40%, then the rest allowance needs to be 60% of the cycle. So you can actually determine 1 minus this is essentially the acceptable duty cycle, the acceptable rest allowance. So it can be used either way. So just to give you an example, if I have a duty cycle of 12% or 0.12 that goes in the equation, it would tell me that the acceptable load to do that, whatever that frequency and duration combination were, that added up to 12% or 7 seconds a minute, it would say that, based on strength data you find, and the advantage of this is we don't have a lot of psychophysical data out there. We don't have psychophysical data for nearly as much as we have strength data. So now, I'm not saying no more psychophysical studies don't need to be done, they certainly do, but in lieu of that, this is sort of the best guess of what a psychophysical study would have given you if you had gone and done it. Or in cases where you know the effort, for example, the effort's 40%, then you could calculate that the acceptable duty cycle would be 12%. So how valid is this? Well, one of the things that I did was I tried to compare it up against other data in the literature. This is kind of a busy slide, but the main thing I want to show you is that this line is quite a bit more conservative than the Romert curves. In fact, I could only ever get the Romert data to touch this curve if I used cycles of 360 seconds. So for example, 30% of 360 seconds, you'd have to have over 100-second contraction where this would be kind of close to what we have. For most of the cases, the Romert equation is not nearly as conservative as what this data would indicate. All of these studies in red, which make up this gray area, every single one of these studies basically were physiological studies where physiological measurements of fatigue were made, invasive measurements, lactates, drawing blood, very invasive, and what they showed was that fatigue occurred within an hour. And so my curve, of course, would need to be quite a bit below that to be acceptable for 8 hours. The other thing I want to point out is Romert, of course, will say that you can do 100% duty cycle at contractions of 15%, but here's data that goes all the way down to 5% showing fatigue within 1 hour. So I think there's data to show that that equation is too liberal, especially at the higher duty cycles. So when I first introduced this to Ford, they were using things like 3D static and strength data and saying, okay, well, you know, what can somebody do maximally? And then I said, well, no, I mean, if they're doing something once a minute, they're doing it 400 or 500 times a day. You can't do 100% of your maximum. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, if you're doing it once a day, you need to be doing it about 65% of maximum. Well, that's ridiculous. So I said, well, you've been doing this all along. When you use the NIOSH equation, at 1 a minute, your frequency correction's about 3/4. When you use the ACGIH-TOV at the lowest hand activity levels, it only lets you do 7 out of 10 or 70%. I mean, this is what people have been doing all along. They just didn't realize it. And in automotive, sometimes people go, well, I can't have a lower frequency. They only do it once a cycle. Well, that's great, but they do 400 or 500 cycles a day. So you need to account for that. And just to show how robust this is, I also took all of the Snook, I'm just showing the lift and lower data, but I took all the data from the lifting, lowering, pushing, pulling, carrying tables, and I said, okay, well, what are the acceptable loads as a percentage of what people said they could do once a day? Not a perfect method, but just wanted to see how this fit. If I lay these dots down in my equation, in fact, the best coefficient, 0.24, is actually the best coefficient for just the lifting and lowering data as well. And it's nice because it kind of fills in the really low duty cycles. And so there seems to be a fair robustness between pushing with your thumb and lifting a load from floor to knuckle height. I mean, there seems to be a general relationship going on here. Now, there needs to be more work to validate this against injury data in the workplace, but it seems fairly robust for a number of different kinds of conditions. So let me just give you an example. So let's say you have some strength data. So Mike Krieg's thesis has, master's thesis has some great strength data. So for example, let's say we look here and we say, okay, I want to, somebody's doing 2.3 efforts a minute, and each effort I can measure with a force gauge or estimate from video is 0.8 seconds. So the duty cycle then would be 2.3 times 0.8 over 60, so about 3%, not really long, about 3% of a cycle. So the maximum acceptable effort would be 1 minus this 0.031 in the equation. It comes out to be about 56%, 0.567. So if you were to do 2.3 efforts for 0.8 seconds each, you would not want someone to go over about 55% of the maximum. So what would that be then? Well, let's say we're going to look at females doing power grasps, and we take the average data, then you would want to, of course, take 0.567 of the average data, 162.3, and your best guess would be about 92 newtons. But let's say, well, I want to design actually for a weak female, 25th percentile, so not to get too much into the stats, but essentially that would be the mean minus about 2/3 of the standard deviation, which would be about 60. So 64 minus 2/3 of the standard deviation would be, so this is for lateral pinch below, would be 56. And then we wouldn't want to go over 31%, or 31 newtons. So there is a way now to take strength data for very specific tasks, and there's lots of it out there, and at least approximate what would be acceptable, and to account for rest allowances. And actually, there's a nice little, a lot of people don't recognize, but a lot of you that use 3D SSPP, there's what's called the fatigue report. And what it tells you is for each joint, what percentage of maximum that task would be for a 5th percentile female, the 25th percentile male or female, depending on which is the one we want. And so, for example, in this task, if I said, well, my MAE is 70%, then you could kind of play around with loads. For example, let's say we're designing for the shoulder, so that none of these went over 70%. So it saves you doing a lot of calculations if you're using this method with something like a shoulder, or an elbow, or a knee, where you basically have tools like 3D SSPP or JACC to get that data from. Now, what's the limitation? I hate to say this, but there is limitations with it. And one of them, of course, is they're very stereotypical tasks. It seems to be fairly robust for these two tasks. It seems to give values that don't change a lot. You might expect they should change a bit, but in the data, it didn't have a huge effect. The longest contractions we had were about 7 seconds, so you really need to use caution with anything over about 10-second efforts. So just to kind of wrap up, what I want to do is talk a bit about, so you need to use caution when you do this, and I want to point out a few things to the people that even are using it now. It's not the duty cycle of everything that people are doing during the task. It's the duty cycle of that thing you're analyzing. So it's the duty cycle of the power grasp, or the duty cycle of the pulp pinch. The future directions, as I'm about to say, is we need to be able to find ways to combine these tasks. And that's kind of what we're doing in our lab, and a number of the people that have sort of joined here for yesterday's meeting are trying to say, okay, well, what happens when you do task 1 and then task 2, and you have a series of tasks all with different demands. And even this is a very simplified version of what the torque over the shoulder, for example, would look like, kind of like the curve that Richard had showed for compression force. That even gets more complex. But let's say you don't come back to 0 every time, and you don't go to the same level every time. What do you do then? And there's almost no data out there on this. One of the organizers of this conference, Marcus Young, did an excellent master's thesis and looked at a number of tasks where the average was always 30%, but things were very, very different. So yes, on-off on-off, so the average was 30%. Some cases where it barely came back down to 0 but didn't quite. Some cases where it oscillated quite a bit above 0. And you can see this continuum in terms of the data collected from the most fatiguing, which was the sustained isometric, where there were no breaks, to the on-off sort of where there were full breaks. So we do not really understand this phenomenon very well, but it's really what many of you need, is how do I deal with tasks that don't just keep coming back to 0 every 3 seconds? Or where people don't get to completely rest. They get some break, but they're down at 1% or 2%. How much of a break is enough of a break? And one thing you might have noticed in my equation is that I didn't bring it out past 90%, because I really wanted this to be for intermittent 90% duty cycle. And when you get above about 90%, you're really looking at sustained contractions. And we don't have a good sense of how low is enough. 0.5%, could you do that all day? Could a trapezius be on at 0.3% every day for 8 hours, or would it start to have mechanical damage? More data is needed for this, and that many of us in this room are sort of taking that on. And I'll just, in the last couple minutes I have, I'll give you a sense of what we've been doing in our lab. I had an excellent undergrad student, Ryan Wells, who, what you see in the underlying curve were the demands on the muscle. So this is a hand grip task where the person held 15% of max for a while, and then held 30%, and then 45%, and then sort of pyramided down, got some rest. And what you saw in the curve was the decrease in their maximum strength over time. And what's interesting though, and makes this much more complicated, is that there were actually times where they were recovering during an effort. So it was like all 15% maximums were not created equal, and all 30% were. If you followed a 15 with a 30, you got a large drop in strength. But if you followed a 15 or you followed a 30 after 45, which seems like a break, then we saw some increases in the strength. And we believe that there's some central peripheral things going on here, and that's what we want to study in the future. But it's much more complicated than we thought. So Mike Son, my PhD student, we're going to tackle this in a couple ways, and I know a number of colleagues are looking at things like this. So we're going to do a psychophysical study at the higher duty cycles. Like I said, Moore and Wells was the only the only study really that we could find that did that, and probably arguably those values were probably higher than, you can see they're quite a bit higher than what I would predict with my equation. So we don't understand this very well. Also, we want to look at trying to tease out the amount of peripheral versus central fatigue, because it's probably what's going on at the muscle, which is most important for the damage to the muscle. And then Laura, who unfortunately I had to leave to go back to Iowa, but she's developed a very simple model which kind of says, well, units are either resting, they're either completely active, or they're completely fatigued, and there are sort of rates from active to fatigue, and there's a rate from fatigue to recovered. And this model is very simple right now, and it really actually seems to predict fatigue fairly well, at least for sustained contractions and some intermittent contractions. And Mike and I want to see if we can kind of incorporate more of a motor unit biological fidelity into this, have some fast twitch fibers, some slow twitch, and see how that improves things. So just to finish, the sort of take-home messages is that we have a lot of data for single strength, but most tasks are repetitive or prolonged in some way. It does seem that psychophysics research can provide some valuable data in terms of what is acceptable for these types of tasks. Duty cycles is a surprisingly strong predictor of what would be acceptable, at least for the data that we've tested it against. I would say publicly that I believe the Romer equation overestimates what would be acceptable for people for intermittent tasks. And finish with saying that more research is needed even for the intermittent tasks, but certainly as we progress to combined tasks and more complex tasks. And then if you want, to make any money off this, so this is not an advertisement, for those of you that are members of ACE, I have a 2-hour talk that includes a lot more than this that you can watch for free. So if you go on the website, you go to ACE webinars, and then if you go here, you can click on View Now to watch that. So a lot of this stuff is gone through in more detail. And then finally, just fund a cast of thousands that have funded this research over about 10 years. Thank you very much. Yes, does anybody have any questions? Say.
You mentioned that Romer equation is too liberal. From a union or worker standpoint, that may be bad news. Because if employers are presently using a Romer equation, and if it's too liberal. So my question is...
Sorry, I think it's the exact opposite.
Okay.
Because basically now, lower loads will be acceptable than we previously thought with the Romer equation. It's management that's not going to like it too much.
Okay, all right. That's good news then.
Someone described it earlier this morning as me throwing a grenade into the room, which may be true.
Okay, so my question is, what is the average age of subjects in your 7 studies compared to Romer's research? Because the age may affect, the average age may affect those curves.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And I really don't, this is a Reader's Digest version of all that research. In fact, all the psychophysical studies we do were done with equal numbers of, typical college-age females, people between 30 and 45, and people between 45 and 60. So we've tried to collect data that represents the working population. So it's not like I can say our range was from 20 to 60, and we had one person that was 60 and the rest were under 30. We would have 8 people in the 45 to 60 range, and same through the other 2 groups. So I think we've accounted for that in the research. Yes.
All the psychophysical research is with healthy population?
Yes.
Okay, so is there anybody at all considering doing research with injured permanent impairment population and how those maximum acceptable levels are when they're reintegrating back into workplace settings?
Yeah, so the goal of course is to find out what healthy people would find acceptable, so you design jobs so that they never become that population. The problem with these tools, and I get this from clinicians all the time, is, well, what do I do with that injured worker? But I suggest, my best approximation of this is through the functional abilities assessments, find out, okay, are you a 10th percentile person for hand grip? And then when you do your calculations, base it on a 10th percentile person, because you have data to tell you what percentile they are for shoulder strength or whatever it is. And then you can, instead of doing the minus 2/3 of a standard deviation, you can calculate the appropriate Z score and do that for. So, most of the tools that are out there will allow you to determine what percentage of the population it would be acceptable for. So in, for example, 3D static, you might say, well, I don't want 75% capable, I want 95 based on the strength for that person. So it's a workaround anyways. Yeah, Howard, there's a mic there.
What was your T limit? How long did you study this? Over what period of time to get your equation?
So
Like when you established the relationship between duty cycle and percent max, how long did the task extend for?
So the task would typically go for, most of the SNOOK and our data would go for about 2 hours that they'd be in the lab. And then there's some data by the Liberty Mutual group to show that you can usually come to, and you need to tell workers that you need to sort of anticipate what you could accept for 8 hours. And what they found is after about 2 hours, knowing that they have to do this for the rest of the day, and I think it speaks a bit to some of the work Linda did, that people are pretty good at projecting what's acceptable to them. They found that you can pretty much arrive at that within 2 hours, but they're using the lab for a pretty good chunk of time.
Okay, what my point is that what we do know is that the cause of fatigue and the rate of recovery from it is going to change over time. And so I'm just wondering how robust this is for longer tasks and things like that.
Yeah, it's a surprise to me that a task that was 7 seconds long, and I have there's more graphs that I can put up here, but I have a graph that kind of shows that we have data that, let's say, has a 20 or a 10% duty cycle that had 7-second efforts that were done relatively infrequently, or had 160 millisecond efforts that were done 12 times a minute. And yet they both came up with similar maximum acceptable efforts. It was more robust than I expected, because you would expect, of course, as you did a longer effort, you would have a sort of exponential increase in the fatigue. But there is data to show that once we got them out to about 2 hours in the lab, they were making pretty good estimates of what would have been acceptable over the whole day. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but we can maybe chat about it after.
You mentioned that you had equal number of participants in different age groups. Can you tell us what some of the age-related factors were? Because a lot of employers are concerned about aging population. Is it just about decreasing strength, or was there other factors that you saw in the data?
We wanted to get a homogeneous representation of what would be the workforce, so we were not as interested in the gender-related factors. We had a few women in the older group that I would term country strong, that were very, very strong ladies from Harrow, Ontario. And so the age-related differences were not as large as we expected. In fact, it was the middle group that actually was, they showed what you'd expect from the young group to the middle group, and then some of these very strong farming people kind of brought the average up. So I don't know exactly if I can hang my hat on the specific forces that we have, but it was the relative, relating what was acceptable to them as a percentage of their maximum. That didn't change across the different age groups. I would like to point out to Jack that I'm under time. Those 4 free minutes. Merry Christmas.